Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
You're listening to Giles Brown on Talk Radio Europe, your voice in Spain. Join the conspiracy. How a Brooklyn eccentric got lost on the right, infiltrated the left, and brought down the biggest bombing network in New York is a fascinating book by Jonathan Butler. I've been looking forward to talking about this for most of the summer, it seems. Delighted to say that Jonathan joins us live on the line now. Jonathan, good afternoon from us. Good morning to you.
Yeah, good afternoon, good morning. Nice to be here.
Whereabouts are you, by the way, on the planet?
I'm in Brooklyn, New York.
And it's Brooklyn, of course, where this whole historical report is set, and it's. I am so interested in this period. I always have been, because it is when the idealism of the 60s of the flower people takes a turn and gets involved in American, hits a brick wall. The '68 convention, of course, in Chicago, the Vietnam War, and then people take themselves acts into their own hands. It gets an awful lot more militant.
Indeed. Well, that's definitely the backdrop to the story. This particular story is about a factory worker from Brooklyn named George Demerly, who was born in the Depression, had a pretty sad childhood, dropped out of school in 8th grade, and became a factory worker. And along the way, he ate up all the right-wing propaganda from McCarthy and people like that who are anti-communist, and so he emerged into adulthood, fearing that the communists were going to take over at any moment. And he joined the John Birch Society and the Minutemen, which were two very right-wing organizations. But he didn't quite fit in there. In fact, one of them, he had to leave because his troop commander threatened to kill him, supposedly. Mm-hmm. So he found himself in the mid-'60s still feeling like a patriot who wanted to save the country from the left wing and the communist people. And he concocted totally on his own this plan. It seemed kind of harebrained at the time, but ended up working in a funny way. He decided to move to the East Village in downtown Manhattan, which was really the center for left-wing radicals at the time. He thought he'd move there and infiltrate the radicals. So he did. He went to a few Socialist Worker Party meetings, and then he cold called the FBI and said, "Hey guys, I'm in. Let's do this." And they said, "Who are you? You're kind of a weird dude. What's going on?" And so they kept him at arm's length for several months. But by the spring of 1967, the FBI kind of woke up one day and realized that these left-wing radicals were actually doing things like stockpiling guns and starting to plan some pretty hairy stuff. So at that point, they said, "All right, we'll put you on the payroll for $50 a week and do your thing. Let's see what you can do."
It just goes to show that perhaps they were a little too trusting. This is a guy who is considerably older than the younger people who were dropping out. Is it sort of that village cafe scene? Everybody's playing folk songs in the background, so everybody's together, man, and that's how he can infiltrate. And he must have had
actually that sort of village cafe scene is actually that we all think of happened a few years earlier. Dylan and Joan Baez and those guys was really the early 60s. And so by 66, in the middle of 66 is when he started showing up at some of these meetings. And, the difference was in the very early 60s in that cafe scene, there was no Vietnam War to be against yet. But at this point in 66, there was already, it was not peaking by any stretch, but the anti-war movement had been going for, 2 or 3 years. And the, left-wing people, the war was one of the two main things that a lot of the left-wing people were against, but the other really was racism.
Yeah, civil rights.
Yeah, the two things. And so by 66, there were really already several groups organizing around opposing the war, and so he kind of slid into that. And also, while he was uneducated, he would show up at these Socialist Worker Party meetings, and he was the proletariat. Most of these Socialist Worker Party meetings are sitting around, and they're actually college-educated people who have put the proletariat up on a pedestal. And one of them walks in, and they say, "Oh, this is great." And so they started giving him reading assignments, and he started going to. There was a place called the Free School on 14th Street that was kind of a center for left-wing intellectuals and radicals that they had classes that were free, obviously, but on everything from LSD to socialism to Cuba, all this kind of stuff. And so he started hanging out there a bit. And fast forward to 1968, Abbie Hoffman started the Yippies.
Yeah.
Also centered in the East Village, and he started hanging out with the Yippies. Got to know Abbie Hoffman, and actually was in Chicago, kind of alongside them.
You see, this is. I mean, 68 is the year. Apart from the fact that it's the year I'm born, so obviously that's one of the things. But and I just love the idea of them going, look, a real member of the proletariat. Quick, let's they'll be doing selfies now. So he's got in there. But 68. I mean, you've got Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which has a huge. There's Walter Cronkite on national TV. Yeah. It's the American embassy in Saigon with Tet operatives inside, and it's completely blown the whole thing open with a body count. You've got the civil rights movement, and there are things that are going to go on in 68 with the assassinations that happen that completely turn it into a more militant organization as well. And you have Hoffman and the Yippies, etc. And what happens in Chicago, which is Mayor Daley, his town, and the way that pans out. And it's really funny because here we are seeing a Democratic conference just happening in Chicago, and worlds away, but then maybe not. So that is the year.
Actually, in 67, you start talking about the parallels till today. In October of 67 was the Pentagon. And so it was actually quite a striking parallel. You had a handful of the guys, and they were mostly guys who I write about, who made it into the Pentagon. They stormed the Pentagon, and they made it inside. They got the crap beaten out of them.
Yeah,
they were there, but they did make it inside. And I was actually incredibly struck watching the imagery on January 6th of the right wing, assault on the Capitol. And I was watching that, I noticed one of the flags they were carrying was the "Don't Tread on Me" flag with the snake wrapping around. And I said, wait a minute, I just saw that in some pictures I was researching. And it's actually the left-wing guys in 67 were carrying the same flag as the right-wing guys on January 6th. And it was, kind of shows that they actually both the sides, I don't want to, it's a false equivalency in my mind and sort of where the morality lines up. But they both felt that the sort of soul of their nation was at stake. And that's, to me, that was really what drew me into this story a lot, was the idea that this generation of people who were they felt so much was on the line, and that they really put aside their own selfish pursuits. You think about art. I'm a year younger than you are, but
right.
If you think about art, in the States, growing up in the age of Reagan and stuff, sure, in college you'd go to an Earth Day festival or something, but most people would come back and then go to their job interview for whatever, Wall Street or journalism, whatever, and kind of keep their own selfish timeline going. And I was really struck by all the people I got to interview who had, at a young age, really devoted themselves to something other than themselves, and it had informed the rest of their lives.
But if you look at it, though, it is because America is fighting for its very soul. And it's the year I'm born, and I've got a big thing with the history of it and the music, but also the civil rights movement as well. And we would call it Black awareness now, but Black Lives Matter. But America was tearing itself apart, as it's been said to be now. And the old values that had, men had come back and women had come back from the Second World War and built a land for heroes in America, but there were dark forces, as were revealed in the 70s, and that's why the 70s that's so fascinating when you find out about the Halliburton, about what Nixon was doing, about the interference, about the black ops, and it really, this sets the tone for the American, what could have been with Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King, etc., and what happened, and we are maybe still feeling the effects of them, but it mattered. For the first time, young people had an interest in politics that wasn't their parents, and they had a media that they could express it through, so it mattered, and that's why it's made a difference.
Yeah, and they really, that's one of the phrases from this period was "bring the war home," and they really got a lot of, at the extreme ends of this, they really started to feel like they were in a war with the imperialistic government that was exporting violence and racism and all sorts of stuff, and they really thought it was a righteous war, and obviously many of them in retrospect admit they went too far, but you can imagine, people in their early 20s getting swept up in this. And, ironically, it's the ringleader of this whole story ends up leading towards this bombing. Right. So there was a group called the Melville Collective, which was started by a guy named Sam Melville, who like George Demerly, was older than a lot of these folks. He was 34 in 1969, and he organized about a half dozen people, and they started setting off bombs in New York City between July and November of 1969. And that's kind of what led me into this story, is that I was a lifelong New Yorker, and I was a history major in college, and I'd actually never heard of this guy or this group. And I started reading up on them, and I saw a mention of this informant who brought them down, and there was almost nothing written about him. But anyway, they started setting off bombs in places like Rockefeller Center, Chase Manhattan Plaza, the criminal courts buildings, pretty high profile spots. They were always set to go off in the middle of the night. They were not trying to hurt anybody, but they were real bombs. They'd middle of the day take a time bomb up into the fifth floor men's room and hide it behind a garbage can or something, and it would go off at 2 a.m. And they luckily never killed anyone, but this happened 7 times until, and really the peak of the book is really Sam Melville ends up meeting George Demerly at Woodstock.
Right.
There's a lot of tentpole events in this book. Not only DNC, but there's a whole chapter that happens at Columbia at the whole protests and violence at Columbia in April of 1968. But there's also a whole chapter on Woodstock, because these two guys. So George Demerly is the protagonist in the book. He joined the Yippies, and the Yippies got back from the DNC, and several of them had thought the Yippies were kind of losing their way, that Abbie Hoffman was getting a little too ego tripping. They started another group called the Crazies, and George Demerly crafted this whole alter ego of Prince Crazy. And he admitted it later. He just basically started copying how ridiculous he thought Abbie Hoffman was. And so he would parade around St. Mark's Place in the East Village in a purple cape and a centurion's hat with an orange plumed feathers, and just totally over the top. And everyone kind of went for it. And the Crazy's signature move was they would take a raw pig's head on a silver platter and sneak it into a luncheon at the Waldorf Hotel that some liberal politician, they liked to go after the liberals who were not liberal enough, and they would strip naked and serve a raw pig's head on a silver platter, to Senator Javits or some other senator who they thought was not against the war enough. And so he was running the merch booth for the Crazies at Woodstock when he met Sam Melville, and they spent the night yapping away, kind of bragging to each other about how radical each one was. And then Sam invited him in to take part in the bombing.
How are his handlers handling him at this point? How are his FBI guys handling him at the moment, at that point?
He's prolific at that point. He's been writing 3 reports a week for the FBI for 3 years. And by that point, he claimed, I had a hard time seeing it in the reports, but he claimed that after he got back from the DNC, that actually he had a shift, that he set out thinking these people were crazy radicals and needed to be brought down. But I think, like a lot of human interaction, the more time you spend with people, regardless of maybe your political views, it humanizes them. And he also, having effectively been an orphan, this is the sort of the irony in the character arc, is that he really had never had a family. He was a bit awkward and never really fit into anything. So ironically, set out to infiltrate this group and to bring them down, but it ended up being kind of the closest thing to family he'd ever had. So when he was then offered to take part in a bombing in November, it really was, the stakes were quite high for him personally, because he was going to blow his cover, lose his gig that it was pretty fun. He was having to, smoke weed and
free love,
enjoy the promiscuous environment of the time, and get paid for it. So he was going to blow his cover, but he was actually, by this point, he was quite attached to a lot of these people and liked them. So he was conflicted about bringing them down by that point. But he did ultimately come to the conclusion that one of these times someone was going to get killed, and it had to stop.
Just so far, we're talking about the Crazies and what Abe Hoffman's been doing. The other flip side, Black Panthers. There are things going on. There are leaders of the Black Panthers being taken out premeditated, I would say, shootings that happened with the leader of the Black Panthers. Much more hardcore, you could say, or much more. They had the potential to be much more devastating. Did he have any interaction with them? And because they would have presumably sniffed him well.
So first of all, it was when the Panther 21 were arrested, that became one of the major causes for protests around the city. So he went to a lot of those, and then actually the lawyer for the Black Panthers was a guy named Art Turco, who was subsequently arrested later on for taking part in an armed for kidnapping, and then someone got killed. But he tried to organize basically a group called like the White Panthers, and according to some of the FBI reports that George wrote, George was given some high up position in this group. It never really got any traction, but he certainly he actually put on a couple fundraisers for one of the first ways he got credibility early on was actually he put on a fundraiser for Huey Newton, and he got the FBI to give like donate $4,000, so it looked like George was the man raising all this dough. So definitely, I mean, there was no, within the white radical scene, there was no greater sign of credibility than the Black Panthers, signing off on you. And in fact, before the Melville Collective started their bombings in July of 1969, they agreed before they started that they needed to get Bobby Seale's seal of approval. They actually went out in late July 1969. The Panthers were hosting a convention in, I guess, Oakland or San Francisco, and so they actually Jane Alpert and the guy named Robin Palmer, who was one of the other major characters in the story, went out to California to get their approval, and supposedly got it. And so that's when they started the bombings.
We want people to actually go out and buy and order the book via our own virtual bookstore. So that's the bit of the taster, if you like, about what happens next, because it is a tale. And it's kind of bittersweet. How do you do the research for this? Because there's lots of images, there's great period photographs.
Oh, incredible. Yeah. So I got into it. I mean, you mentioned rock and roll at the beginning of this. I actually stumbled into this whole topic. I was looking for actually a screenplay idea, and I'm a lifelong Grateful Dead fan.
Yeah, okay. It's the it's the Hoffman and it's the Allen Ginsberg thing coming up. Here we go.
I decided to read Bill Graham's autobiography, and Bill Graham was the legendary rock promoter who had the Fillmore West in San Francisco, and then in March of 1968, he took over an old Yiddish theater in the East Village that he called the Fillmore East.
Yeah,
and he ended up having this legendary fight with. There was a group in the East Village called Up Against the Wall Motherfuckers. This guy named Ben Maria, who's still alive, who I interviewed a couple times.
Yeah, okay.
Guy, wild guy. But that kind of got me into the story, and I did a Freedom of Information Act request on a couple of the guys, and George Emerly in particular. Got that back, and then a friend of mine is, I don't know if he's a private investigator or he's skilled in the dark arts of searching the internet. And I knew that George had been married 4 times, and I thought maybe his 4th wife would still be alive. So I was able to track her down. I sent her an email, and she called me back half an hour later, and I said to her, did George have any stuff that might be helpful? And she said, oh yeah, there's a box in the closet. I think about throwing away every couple of years. Do you want it? So she sent it. And it was full of. He kept every flyer from every demonstration.
No, gold
photos, all this incredible stuff.
Yeah.
Personal letters, all this stuff. When I got that box, is when I knew I had, this should be a book and not a screenplay. And then at the very end of the process, the same friend who was helped me find. I realized that there was another undercover guy who was a photographer for a Spanish language newspaper in the city who had covered. I'd seen a couple of his photos from very specific obscure events, and I tracked down his daughter-in-law and ended up driving up to the woods of New Hampshire, where she pulled out another big box full. Maybe had probably 1,000 8.5 by 11 black and white photographs, and I went through them all, and maybe 30 or 40 of them were literally documenting these incredibly obscure scenes I described in the book. Literally, I'd say, oh, and then they walked across the street and a van came by, and then someone tripped, and it would be like, a picture of someone having tripped. It was like uncanny. And so the book ended up having, I think, 60 photographs in it that are really detailed. A lot of these fun scenes with people doing stuff with pigs' heads, and lots of great naked photos. The Crazies put out 4 issues of Crazy magazine.
Yep.
And their masthead photos is 4 of them totally nude, full frontal nude, holding AK-47s. That was like the masthead photo. You should see how that would go.
Yeah,
that
that would work. That would get the attention. Absolutely. I mean, but it is fascinating because it is. It's within our lifetimes. I mean, hey, we're born in that sort of period of time, but it does seem another lifetime ago. There's a certain innocence of that politics that then gets radicalized, and then, as I said before, we see by the 70s we've got Paddy Hearst joining the Liberation Army. You've got the bombs exploding. And in Europe you've got Baader Meinhof. You've got Red Army faction, etc., etc. So it's a really interesting period where, and obviously Vietnam 73, the Americans pull out finally, but much before then, and that becomes this nightmare. And we get Watergate, etc. Fascinating stuff. But it must be very interesting to chart that, and also have this guy who very few people probably would know about.
I mean, I don't think anyone knew about it. I mean, maybe a couple of people who had written about Melville, but even Melville was a pretty obscure chapter of American history. So, this guy was really he was, all I could find about him in books was a couple sentences. There was really nothing about him. So that made it pretty fun. And that the detective work, it was the most fun part of it. Writing can be satisfying or drudgery, depending on the day, but the thrill of the chase was really intoxicating.
What do you hope that people will take or learn from Join the Conspiracy?
Well, to me, I actually think it's sort of I personally am actually a reasonably moderate person. And so I think probably the biggest lesson coming out of it is to be wary of extremism in all its forms. And as I was saying earlier about, both the Pentagon in 1967 and January 6th carrying the same flag, I think it made me think of politics not so much as a linear, a line from left to right, but really more of a circle that wraps around. And those extreme ends can get kind of blurred and are dangerous, I think. But I also think, going on the journey, George's personal journey of starting out with such strong black and white assumptions about a group of people, and then as he gets into them, the people being humanized and him waking up to some of, he didn't go for all of their stuff, but realizing that they actually had the cause they were fighting for actually were quite meaningful, and they were actually at heart pretty good people. So I think that those are probably sort of the lessons or the subtext or whatever of the book.
The book is called Join the Conspiracy. If people want to find you online, do you do the social media? Is there a website? Where can people find out more about this?
I have a website, jonathanbutler.org, and my handle on both Instagram and X is jrbutler69, and there's also an Instagram page at Join the Conspiracy Book.
The book is called Join the Conspiracy. You can order it You can order it from our own virtual bookstore. Join the Conspiracy. It is by Jonathan Butler. Jonathan, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you this afternoon, stroke morning.
All right. Thanks so much.